Let's see, share my screen. And okay, so I've met 2/3 of you before, and Deva, nice to meet you today. So, and thanks, Kit, for inviting me to give this workshop. It's been something that I've wanted to do to start beginning to do better, more outreach on campus. And so this is kind of an appealing format, a small group where I can go through the material, but also have the opportunity for people to ask questions as we go and really, focus on the specific needs and specific questions that people have. So this is my group, and we've been doing, a combination of grant funded and like more ad hoc research. And now we're getting more into outreach and not just training, but enabling research more broadly throughout the College of Ag and Life Sciences here. So I have organized this around this data management lifecycle, and there's a few different sources that I've leaned on heavily for this presentation. One of which is Data One has a lot of great materials, a lot of great training materials. And there's actually a visiting scientist who I didn't list in the last page, but a visiting scientist from the National Center of Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And her boss is also the PI of Data One. She's a trainer. So she's also helped me develop this material. In any case, that's a great resource. And this is a data management lifecycle. I think that their resources are a good go-to place to get started. In any case, this can kind of be divided into two parts. One is the fun part that people think of when they're thinking about scientists, is the discovery and the analysis. And then there's the hard work that goes into collecting data, making sure that it's usable, doing the quality assurance, and etc. That's the focus of today's workshop. And to this, they didn't explicitly put this in their data management lifecycle, but there's also a key component, which is sharing. So increasingly, science has moved from small, within a lab, collecting the data, analyzing it, and doing a publication, small author list, to very large. Nowadays it's not uncommon to find very large consortia of people working together. And so a lot of the work I do, for example, I'm in a role of helping to build communication between people, the scientists who are collecting the data and the advanced statisticians and computer scientists who want to use the data. And so in that context, it's really important to be able to share the data and be able to effectively communicate about the data and let each other understand what exactly is going on, what the important questions are, and etc. So just starting with how to plan to collect your data. This is something that comes up quite a bit, especially now, since fortunately, many funding agencies have begun to require data management plans. In fact, I don't think that I've submitted a proposal recently that didn't require a data management plan. And it can be kind of daunting when you're asked to prepare a data management plan. So for example, the NSF has clearly defined sections about what types of data you're going to collect, what the data and metadata standards are, what your policies are for access, sharing, and privacy, and policies for reuse, redistribution, and data derivatives, as well as what your plans are for archiving and preservation. And finally, the roles and responsibilities of the people on the team. So before I go further, I want to ask, has anybody here who's written a data management plan? I'm going to assume that we have two people who have written data management plan. So I'm curious if either of you all have included the execution of the data management plan in your funding request.
Yes, I did. In fact, we just turned in one that is more than like 30 pages long to DOE, and they were very meticulous about it too. So,
so you explicitly asked in your budget for money to manage, store, archive the data.
yeah, and the interesting part for the DM we wrote is that they don't want to hold the data. They want us to place it into some like a data.gov or Data One or one of the other places on the cloud. So it's more for them to ensure that we follow whatever procedures more than them wanting the data.
Okay, yeah. And how about you, Kit?
No, I've never written one and didn't know that there was a requirement now for, so this is news for me.
Okay, yeah, so it's an important requirement, and if I'm reviewing your proposal, I will definitely look at not only the plan, but also whether or not you have planned carefully to actually execute it, because so that's the next part is, don't forget to put it in your budget and your statement of work to execute it. So when I review a proposal and a data management plan, I look not only that it's budgeted, but also whether or not the people have already demonstrated the activities that they're proposing that they're going to do. Like, do they have data that's been archived? Have they been putting their code on GitHub as they say that they plan to do? Right now, there's a big complaint that, the data management plans don't have a lot of teeth. They don't, there's no real checking in and compliance. And really that comes primarily at the review stage at this point. But I believe it will be changing moving forward. So when confronted with this question of, how to write a data management plan, I think that best place to start is to go to this tool called the Dmp Tool. So the Dmp Tool is developed by the California Digital Library, but many universities participate. And so, and their librarians help to provide guidance. So if you can see in this example, each of those bullet points that I had on the last slide becomes something that you can open up and start writing in, and it gives you guidance. So it gives you, the general guidance for that the funding agency provides, and then it also gives you guidance that can come from each individual institution. So in this case, I can't remember why I chose UT Austin, but usually if there's a number of institutions on the proposal, I'll see if there's guidance from their libraries. It will tell you some generic information as well as institution-specific requirements or resources like what our library provides in terms of data archival. So this is very handy, and absolutely I would recommend that you use the Dmp tool the next time you have to write a data management plan. And you can even share it. So I've made this one public, so you can see in here. Since I'm logged in, you can see it anyways. But just to give a little bit of, here's the writing plan part. Let's see. So University of Arizona didn't give any guidance there. But they do down here for the archiving and preservation. They'll say that the UA data repositories is a place that you can put your data. So we'll get into repositories later in the talk, but it's really a great tool. So that's really all. Oh yeah.
So is this something that we should have placed on like our website in our business center or on so that our faculty know about this tool?
Yeah, I think that it would be worthwhile to tell the faculty about the tool. and there are workshops that the library gives to introduce people to it, but it's pretty self-explanatory. If you know, I could write a summary of some of the resources that I provide and send it out, and for anybody who's not here, well, a lot of folks who aren't here, and include this in there.
Yeah.
So,
This is, yeah, thank you so much.
mm-hmm. Okay, so that's really, you know, it covers the planning part. I mean, not all of it, but a lot of the rest of the talk will include the elements of the plan, because as you plan, you're going to need to know how to collect the data, which is the next step. And there's a lot of different methods of collection. I'm going to focus mostly on spreadsheets, because a lot of times sensors will generate a pretty, you know, standard consistent data type, and then there's ways in which you have to process those. I guess a lot, you know, or you can create tables, and the tables that those sensors should create will follow a lot of the same rules that a spreadsheet will create. Then there's lab and field notebooks, but typically the information in the lab and field notebooks will be transferred to spreadsheets. And also synthesis, just as somebody who does quite a bit of meta-analysis for its own sake, as well as for model parameterization, we do, you know, we're digging in the literature a lot to get numbers out of the data, out of the literature, but often that is just putting it into spreadsheets, again, organizing it in spreadsheets. And so there's two citations here. The first is, you know, simple guidelines for effective data management, and I say some of their rules kind of say don't use spreadsheets, you should use all text files, etc. But they're not. It's not really that practical. In practice, spreadsheets are very powerful. And also, you know, since this was written only about 12 years ago, there have been a lot of advances in the way, you know, in spreadsheets. Excel itself has improved, but the both Microsoft and Google provide, you know, online collaborative spreadsheets similar to Google Docs that you can collaborate on, and you can also version. You can now in Google Spreadsheets version individual cells. So spreadsheets are not and probably never will be the gold standard for archival purposes, but for the development of data sets. So in this part of collection and organizing and QA/QC, they're very important. So this paper, Data Organization in Spreadsheets, says this is how to use them. And so we'll go through some of these different topics. So there are other types of data storage formats beyond just tables that I'm going to focus a lot of the next few slides on. As I've mentioned, I'll talk a little bit later about images, point clouds, and HDIF5/NetCDF data, which have a lot of great value. Those are called binary formats, and those allow data to be compressed quite a bit, so you can get a lot of data in one place. They also allow you to quickly access the data. So when you're talking about gigabytes of data, you can't. The computer has a hard time reading through text files and figuring out what's in there without some information about what's going to be in there. Databases similarly are efficient for accessing data, and to a lesser extent for storing data or for archiving data. Usually if you want to archive a database, the recommendation is to dump it out into something like a NetCDF file or a text file. So I wanted to start out with these best practices that Boer et al. Put out there, even though they very much say don't use spreadsheets. Essentially, they say use a scripted program for analysis like R and Python or MATLAB. Store your data in a text file like a CSV file. Store the data in non-proprietary hardware formats. and always store an uncorrected data file with all of its bumps and warts. So that's an important part. So you should always, when you collect the data, you should, no matter how you process it, you should always keep that original data set, because you may want to go back to it, or other people may want to go back to it. So once you clean it up and etc., there are different ways of doing that. We'll talk a little bit about maintaining the provenance. The idealized way is to use a scripted program, so to take it in, use software to interactively clean up your data and reorganize it. But usually or in a lot of cases, it's easier to do this within a spreadsheet. And so while a scripted program, the idea is that it's exactly reproducible, and that's ideal. It's just it's a cost benefit of how much time it takes to script a data cleaning process versus doing it the way a lot of people are familiar with and is handy with the interaction of a spreadsheet. But if you don't use a scripted program for analysis, then it's recommended that you keep track of all the steps between that uncorrected data file and the data that is used later in analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about organization, sharing and versioning, and more about the limitations of spreadsheets. So this woman, Jenny Bryan, is a professor at the University of British Columbia, and she also works at RStudio, and she's developed a lot of R tools that enable the use of spreadsheets. So it used to be very hard to use spreadsheets, but now some of the tools she's created help to reorganize, help to clean up a lot of the messy parts that we'll discuss in the coming slides. It helps to extract components. And it can also connect to a Google Sheet. So you can have a Google Sheet and you can access it directly rather than having to save it as a CSV file. It's still better to save it as a CSV file and have a text-based representation that's kind of the canonical one that everybody's using and isn't modified, or you can always tell if it's been modified. But in practice, it's also very handy to be able to pull down the data from a spreadsheet, at least for the QA/QC and exploratory data analysis steps. So this paper comes through with a lot of best practices for spreadsheets. And in this workshop, it's difficult to go through all of the detail in each of these. And I highly recommend reading this paper. I don't know any other way around it. But it's kind of like a lot of these steps they're analogous to when I first started working in the lab, and there's all these laboratory protocols. There's some, I had to read the MS, I forget what it was called, but the material safe, the MSDS, a material safety data sheet for each thing in the lab. I had to read the protocols. I had to learn how to work. The same thing goes for both software and data. There's best practices, and in order to have data that can be reused not only by yourself, but also by others, it's necessary to follow these best practices. So,
David?
Yes.
Eventually, would you be able to give us that citation so that it's a little difficult to see in the in what looks to be like a business card size?
Yeah, it's a screen clip. I've got a page of references and another page of other resources at the very end. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So one is to have consistent variables and file names. It is, I'd say, more common than not to find data that's collected over many years to have small differences in variables names that make it difficult for a computer to understand. So if you have the name of a species and in one year it's an abbreviation, and another year it's written out with a space in it, another year it's letters capitalized or not, those are all understood by a computer as being different entities, and it's hard for the computer, and in many cases even the human, to easily be certain that these variables mean the same thing if their names are inconsistent. And by good, naming variables, sometimes people name them, sequentially by letters A, B, C, D, but it's better and easier to have long variable names that are human readable. And we'll see some examples of those in a few slides when I talk about metadata. So dates, I think probably the only standard I've come across that there's no question about it. Nobody really will argue about this. I take that back, somebody will, I'm certain it's happened. But for the most part, putting your date in the year, month, day format is the standard. And so they should always be encoded like this, and then hours, minutes, seconds. And then there's other ways to put and then there's a few ways to put the time zone at the end. This is an ISO standard that is unambiguous. And it also has a handy feature of sorting by date, as opposed to if you put the day first, for example, or the month first, you won't be able to sort easily by date. I name a lot of my files this way. So all of my presentations, for example, I start with the year, month, day, and it's nice because it makes it easy to organize. There's a lot of meaning that somebody can get out of an empty cell. Like, was the data not collected? Was something not there, or was the data not collected, or was the data collected and lost? It's not clear. There can be a lot of problems with empty cells. So having NA instead of an empty cell is useful. I mean, is recommended. There's also a lot of cases in which you will see other values standing in for missing data. Commonly, you might have a file type that won't allow you to put a text in a number field, and people will use -9999 for something similar for missing data. And it can, that can be useful, but it can also result in errors that you won't know about. So if you take the mean across a vector, and one of the numbers is -9999, it'll throw it off and you won't know what it is. The other...
Matt still uses the -9999 here on campus.
Who does?
Matt, Arizona Meteorological,
yeah.
The group here on campus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will. They're getting a new coordinator, so hopefully I can.
Okay.
Yeah, chat with him about it. Okay, so having one type of information per cell, so not like if you've got a name, not combining it with also with the date of collection. In some cases it's useful to do that, but in other cases, but it makes life more difficult further down the line. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means about making it a rectangle, but this is one of the key ideas in developing tabular data is if you think about your data as an object that you want to add rows to. So every time you make a new observation, you can add a row and not have to add a new column. And the reason is that if you come in and you add a new column, you're going to end up with a lot of missing data. And so, the question is, how can you organize your data so that you can add rows rather than columns? And I'll talk a little bit about that when I describe data normalization. The caveat is that a lot of times it's useful, and a lot of statisticians, computer scientists, they just want a big matrix of numbers. They want everything in a column. Fortunately, it's relatively straightforward to reorganize data on the fly for analysis, to reshape it. But for the purposes of collecting and storing data, it's better to organize it in that way, and we'll describe that when I talk about data normalization. So having a data dictionary. So it's useful in a spreadsheet when you have multiple worksheets to be able to have one page that's a Readme, and we'll talk about Readmes in a second, and have another page or included in the Readme, the data dictionary, which identifies each header, the name of each column in your spreadsheet. When saving it as a CSV file, often you'll see all this information contained in a header. There'll be like a number sign, which means it's commented out. It helps the programs ignore that or identify it as a comment. And then it has all the definitions. So that's how AsMet provides their data, for example. But the idea is that having the name is not enough if you don't know what the units or what the meaning is. And this gets back to that other best practice from the other paper we were talking about, in the previous slide, which is not to do any calculations in your raw data files or worksheets. It's another great thing about worksheets. You can bring the raw data file, you can copy one worksheet into another worksheet and start to organize it, do summary statistics, etc. But including that in the raw data file, it messes it up and it makes it often harder to recover. Although, as I said, there is versioning in spreadsheets now. It's still more trouble than it's worth. This is an easy way of not having to wonder what your data originally was. Also, anything you can't export as a text, as a piece of text or a number, shouldn't be your data. Highlighting is useful. It's useful for when exploring the data. Excel has some great tools for highlighting according to number to identify, for exploratory data analysis. But identifying some important piece of information by color is asking for information to be lost. And also use data validation to avoid errors. So one of the great things about spreadsheets is that you can identify, you can say, what happens in each column. So each column, this column must be a character, you must have text in it, and this column must be a number, this column must be decimals. And you can also provide ranges to throw errors when you try and enter incorrect data. Okay, so now here's a question for the audience. There are some problems with this spreadsheet. Most of them I think I've described, and I'm curious if folks can identify any. Feel free to send me comments.
There is a calculation.
Yep, there's one right here.
Yeah, and the whole column P is a calculation.
Oh yeah.
And same with Q.
Yep. Awesome.
And they highlight, and you used highlight for the total.
Yep.
That's okay.
So I think in this case, the highlight isn't representing data.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, that column shouldn't be there in the first place. So that's a good point.
So I got curious about that you want to add rows and not columns. Why is having rows with zeros worse than columns with zeros? No. So, when you're saying don't add columns because there's going to be a whole bunch of zeros, but if you have a row, you could have a whole bunch of zeros. So I guess it's not clear to me the difference.
Okay, yeah, so when we get, maybe it'll get clear when I talk about data normalization in a few slides, but the idea would be that, the zero, if by zero you mean missing data, you would just not add that. Like, so if you add a column, so if all of a sudden I came back and I was like, oh, well, I just measured a root on this tree, I want to keep the biomass of that root, then I would have to have like no information from any of these individuals, except for this entire column would be empty except for that one place where I add a root.
Right.
If I reshape this so that let's see. So we have species tree, then we would have like the organ, you know, trunk, limbs, branches, leaves, roots. Then I could have this column, and maybe not every individual would have every single organ measured, but you would only have, you could add one row and say, this thing has a root and it weighs this much. So,
Okay.
so the missingness is implied by the fact that there's no row for the other individuals.
I see.
Okay, and okay, so anything else here?
Come on, folks. Don't let me be the
Column-
only one.
Column B is mixed up text and numbers now?
Yep. Yep, that's correct.
That's pretty messy.
Yeah. There's also some spaces in the names which can cause some trouble, but that's.
Yeah.
Anything else?
You said no empty cells, like, so H would be a whole column of empty cells.
Yep. That actually gets at an even bigger problem that we'll get to.
Oh, yeah, because if you go across, we have SE, and then it turns into tree. And oh no, the next one down is SE, but then it becomes PSME. So they're not the same. So on the same row, you have different information.
Yep. Yeah. And there's also some evident, some comments up in here, these little things right here, which won't get exported if you put it into a data set. I mean, if you export it into a CSV file. So I've got a few examples of what could be improved here. So first, there's actually 3 tables here.
Yeah.
And so, and it's not clear what they, you know, how they're related, or if one is a summary of another. Another, as Kit, as you pointed out, these are all are they the same observation or no? I think from what I can tell, they're not the same observation because you have 2 species in the same row. And also, is this all the same variable? No, this is, as you pointed out, that's a total. You have these marginal sums down here. And so this is a type of sheet that might be useful for reorganizing data as kind of a sandbox, but it should not be the way that the primary data is stored or shared. This is kind of using the spreadsheet as a sandbox or a sketch pad, not as a way of maintaining data. I guess when I say sketch pad or explore, you know, taking sums is essentially exploratory data analysis, which is great, and spreadsheets can do it, but it shouldn't be confused with the raw or with the, you know, canonical data. Okay, so this rule that I mentioned earlier was when you add data to a database, you try not to add columns, rather you design your table so that you would add only rows. So this is one way of seeing this transformation. So as I was mentioning, you know, a statistician may want to see this format that says no over here. They may want to throw this into an analysis, and it might be useful in some cases. But for the collection and sharing of data, having it reorganized in this way, which is analogous to what I was trying to explain in the last slide, is essentially taking it from what's considered a wide format to a long format. So in this case, if you came back to, you know, say that you came to the 3rd site, and there was a species 6, then in this case, you'd have to add one more column. And in fact, if you were going to very different sites, and you would have a lot of missing data, whereas in this, you know, over here, you could have different species in every single plot, but you'd always have 3 columns. And that's important because if you're building software or writing a script to analyze these data sets, it's useful if you can write it so that you're always expecting the same shape of the data, as well as same column names and same data types. So this is what I mean by adding rows and what would be considered tidy data. And I mentioned this word earlier called normalized data, which I won't get too far into, but it is a nice way of organizing your data. One way of thinking about it is that you have this table, you have the site, the species name, the abundance. You may have your README file that says, that describes like site. This means, this is a string that is a way of describing, or is a name for this location. But some of the things that are missing here are, and importantly, that I would like to know, probably if I was looking at species abundance, is where this was collected and when. So there's a missing data, a missing date column, but just to illustrate the idea of normalization, so you could have a latitude and a longitude column in here, but that would require that you have 5 different rows that repeat exactly the same number, which again can be useful. But if you wanted to come back and change that number, then you'd have to change it in all 5 rows, and you'd have to make sure you sorted your data sheet so that you see all those cases where you have this particular site and you want to change that number. But if you have a separate table and you have a site and you have a latitude and a longitude, then you only need to record that once for each site. So that's the basic idea of data normalization. And so I'll show that a little bit more here. So this is kind of another way that you might collect species data. Different. So so this is good. This is actually another good practice for collecting tabular data, is always to have an ID field, so you always know what that row is. And I just was reminded of it, even though in looking at these papers, I don't think that I saw that brought up. But so you have the date and you have the site ID that's just numbered, site name, presumably the temperature at that site when it was collected. Now you have 2 pieces of information for each species. So species 1, the code for it, and species 2 code, species 2 height. So this is kind of the wide format. We have the same problem again. If we wanted to record another piece of information, say the diameter of a tree or a 3rd species, then we would have to add a lot more additional columns. And so if we look here, so we've got some information about the plant species here, got information about the site, and we've got some information about each species inside this data set. So how can we take these and normalize the data set? So you go from this, if you reorganize it like so, you can see again, you can go from the site ID, and from that site you can have the name and the temperature. I would still like to see some latitude and longitude, but then again, you don't have to keep track of the numbers of the species. You have one column that contains all the information identifying species, one column containing all the information identifying height. There's one more step that you could do to normalize this. It may or may not be useful depending on the context, which is to have in this final column, you could have just the variable, and then have this list say height, and I mentioned earlier height, diameter, and then here have the value. And so to be truly normalized, well, it's hard to say truly normalized, because there's always this, there's like the computer science theory approach, and then there's really the practical approach. And so, and there's, like 6 steps to normalization. So it's really a matter of what's practical, but the next step of normalization would be to name that, a variable, and then have the value over here. And you could actually, you could squeeze it down even further to probably 2 columns if you went extreme, but that gets to be where it's not useful. So this right here, the idea here is that you have one entity, you have one species at one site, and this is the information that you have about it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what methods of sharing data. As I mentioned, I'm going to focus on spreadsheets, sharing and versioning them. So in practice, it's the most effective way of not just collecting it, but conversing about it. It's very difficult to follow those rules of always collecting data in CSV files. First of all, because there aren't very good editors. The way in which you naturally edit a CSV file is to go in and edit a text file, which doesn't give you the column, doesn't give you all the power of a spreadsheet. And also, now that we have online shared Google Docs, it's a really powerful way of being able to share data and get feedback on it, what's needed and what's not. And in a lot of cases, it's, there's a lot of iterations between the data collector and the data user to figure out where, the best way to organize the data and what data is actually needed. So versioning, one way, probably the most common way, and the way that I and probably many people started out is illustrated in this comic of naming your files. And that is a very useful and powerful way of versioning your files. But now there are even better ways of doing it. So if you were to use your, the file naming conventions, and then this is a case where, having a date would make it so that you don't have to, you can sort it, and you don't have to remember, what each of these comments that you've added to the name of it actually means. So we won't get away from this anytime soon, but the sooner we do, I think the better. So I threw this in there because, so I didn't get a lot into, project management or using Git and GitHub in this workshop. Git is a way of versioning text files. It's most commonly used for managing code for software and for sharing it and working collaboratively on it. However, it's also can be used for text files. So at a particular size, so some few thousands of rows at the maximum, you can actually check these text files into GitHub, and you can look at them and you can see the changes, you can track the changes. It's not ideal. There's a lot of problems and reasons why this doesn't exactly work for data in the same way it does work for text files that you like software. And so there's a number of new projects trying to figure out how to do Git for data. So let's see. Well, yeah, I was going to provide this example of a data set that we're working on for a project that is really just curating data sets from Neon for our collaborators to analyze. And so first you see we've said that this is all Neon's data. It's all public domain. So we don't technically have to say anything about the data use since it's public domain, except, from a legal standpoint, but from the scientific standpoint, you have to tell people where your data come from. And so we'll get into that later when we talk about licensing. But I just wanted to show, so here we've got the code used to pull this data down from the Neon API, and then we've got this CSV file that, well, it's too big to view raw, but this CSV file that we can share with our collaborators. And then also issues, so we've got some requests for changes to the data, and we can link these to changes in any of the text files that are in this repository. So again, GitHub is really powerful. It's very useful for scientific collaboration. It's I don't know. I mean, I don't even want to say that it's outside of the scope of data management, but there's enough material to describe Git and GitHub that it could easily be its own, workshop or 3. And finally, I wanted to say, so databases, they're designed to handle row-wise versioning. So there's a very simple way in which you could take a text file or a table and mark one row as having been superseded by another row. So essentially, rather than looking at how this text has changed, like you might do in track changes, you just have one row and it says this row is no longer valid. Go see the next, row 5,000,002, and you go down to 5,000,002, and it's essentially that row, except it is now valid. So that's also beyond the scope of most of this talk, because I don't really get into how to use databases too much. But the idea is there that instead of like deleting a row or changing a cell, you would just mark that as wrong and add the correct row at the end. So there's a lot of ways in which to, I threw this under advanced data sharing. So using Google Drive and Box, I think are nice. And I should add the Microsoft. Microsoft is also pretty much feature compatible, or not compatible, but it's got equivalent features as Google Drive and Box. You can also collaborate on the same spreadsheet, for example. I'll talk next about the Open Science Framework, which I think is a really powerful tool for organizing work that integrates a lot of different components that we've discussed so far. For very large data sets, and so I know, Kamel, you have an interest in this. I'm happy to discuss more in detail. One thing I'll say that's neat is that Google Drive provides unlimited data storage for anybody at the University of Arizona. I think anybody with an educational account, G Drive account, you can put unlimited data. And I have actually tested this out, and you can put up to 750 gigabytes a day onto Google Drive, which is a tremendous amount of data for them to provide it to us unlimited.
Is there like a, sorry, David, but is there like a mechanism to gain that unlimited access, or is it open to everybody?
Open to everybody.
Because I'm paying, I bought 2 terabytes, and I'm paying almost like $100 a year for it. I use it as a big repository for my stuff, so I'm not really sure. Are you certain?
Yeah, I'm fairly certain.
Okay.
I mean, do you have it? Are you using your U of A G Drive account?
No, actually, I use it on top of my Gmail account, my regular Google account, and I have my U of A box separately. But my Google Drive is kind of grew over the last number of years, and then I outgrew it, and I had to buy. So they offered me $100 2 terabyte disk limit. That's kind of how it was at the time. Okay, I'll explore it. Maybe there's a way around it.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
I was like, just like for OneDrive, everybody who has, I think, Microsoft Office gets a OneDrive, but there's a OneDrive University of Arizona, which is different. And it has like 10 times, I don't know, it's 10 times more space than Box has. It's a huge amount, but I also was told that Google Drive, probably Google Drive U of A, will have the unlimited. So you need to have, right now, Google doesn't know that you're part of a university. So you have to go through the university system and probably get a Google Drive University of Arizona, which is tied then to the university so that they know you're academic.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of this. Okay.
I just found out about it on Friday.
That'll save me $100. I'd be paying it out of pocket.
Yeah. I think I've got almost 100 terabytes on Google Drive now.
Okay, very good.
there's some question. I mean, like one question that you'll have to address. I think maybe moving it from Google Drive to Google Drive won't be as hard, but moving it from a server to Google Drive. Well, I used Globus, and I spoke with Blake Joyce at the UITS at the HPC Center about figuring out how to do that. But it's possible to do. It's just I mean, as far as like, they say that it's unlimited, but when you're uploading it from your desktop, especially from home, it's a lot of data to be moving, hundreds of gigabytes a day and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, for a few terabytes, you can do it, relatively slowly over the course of a few weeks, then should be okay, especially if it's already within Google Drive. Okay, and I didn't talk about databases and APIs. That's also like very rich, topic. A lot of information and a lot of power there to organize your data and make it accessible and make it searchable, especially when you get to bigger data sets. The one thing I'll say about, well, there's so much to say. So the one thing I was going to say about APIs, because people often hear about databases, and a file, a CSV file, can be considered a database. Often when people say databases, they're thinking of something like MySQL or Postgres, something that's you have a server and it's running this program and it's managing your data, and it makes it efficient to be able to search and actually do analyses on data. So there's a lot of math. Basically you can program a database, and whether you're using Python or MATLAB or R, you can do a lot of the computation in the database and make it much more efficient because you don't have to read it all into memory. So if you have more data than your memory, then the databases are a great way to do that. And then I'll mention APIs real quickly, because there's a lot of talk of, data exchange formats. APIs are ways in which you can make data available on the web, and also coerce data, no matter what as long as you've got the information, no matter what your data looks like under the hood, the APIs provide a layer to conform to community standards. And so that's pretty powerful. That means that your data storage can change, and your API, like how the data stored can change based on your need, and how the data is provided can always be the same. So again, this is all advanced, but I will talk a little bit about the Open Science Framework. I've been using it in my group, and what it does, so you may come away from this and say, wow, there's GitHub and Google Drive and wikis, etc. How can I like make this all in a coherent, put it all in one way, in a coherent way, in a coherent fashion? And then you might say that, but I also don't want to like add one more tool to my toolbox or migrate everything. So this is a nice way in which to, I guess, a nice middle ground between the two, because it allows you to link a lot of the storage, like Google Drive and GitHub, to like an interface that allows you to maintain and develop materials. So I'll show you. So one, there's a wiki. So this opens up the wiki, and you can maintain your wiki there that describe your data. There's a lot of storage providers that you can link into. So Google, all the ones: Box, Google Drive, Microsoft, I think Globus. Any case, so you can link to those, and you can open it up, and you can actually like navigate the file system, and in some cases, for some file types, edit the files within this interface. And then you can get a citation for this. So you can like mark it at a particular time, and essentially archive the content. Not all the content. I mean, the caveat is it's not all the content in all of these linked drives, but it is all of the text content in here. And it's just, it provides a reliable way to link to this information. And finally, there's all these components down here. So you can nest it. So within a lab, you could have like your lab overview, and then you can have, for each project or each experiment, you can have a different component and store all of the information associated with that. So So yeah, so that's important. It can become part of your data management plan and be a nice place to store and organize all of your documentation, metadata, notes, etc. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about validation. This is probably my shortest section, although it's the, one of the most important. And the reason is because it's hard to come up with a lot of general statements about.
David, can I ask a question before?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, please. Have you ever worked with data.gov at all? It's a cloud repository too, but mostly for like kind of government stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, my understanding is that it's a what is it called? It's sort of like Data One is a it aggregates a lot of places, right? So it aggregates all these government-funded data repositories.
Okay. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So when you ask have I worked with it, so I've used it to search for data, and then I have deposited data at the National Ag Library, which is indexed by data.gov.
Yeah. So the mechanism is very similar to kind of like some other maybe like repositories in a way.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know that that data.gov is a repository itself. I could check into that, but I mean I think that you would go to whether it's NASA or USDA or what, they would have like their repositories that you can you put your data in, and then data.gov is a way to search across all of the government repositories.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, we can take a look. It's really been a great it's a great way to be able to search across a lot of data sets.
Huh.
Oh no, my connection really isn't very good. Oh no. Okay. Have I been breaking up? I'll just say NDVI. Let's see what we can get in there. So if you look through here, let's see. You can see all the standard, stuff. You can search it, federal government. So it's like aggregating it from all these different places. And
I see.
Yeah, and any of these, so all of these repositories are where you can put the data, but there's no place here to, I mean, that I'm familiar with to deposit your data. I think you would use your appropriate one. So
I got you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So QA/QC. So the gold standard for data validation is to enter the data twice, to essentially have two people collect the same data and enter it and compare it and make sure that they're the same. In many cases, that's really impractical. Although one of the things I've done is I've had, when extracting data from publications, have somebody, one person extract the data and then somebody else go back and verify that they can see this data point came from this location in the paper. So that's pretty close to that. The other tool that I mentioned above is that spreadsheets and databases, you can add value constraints on any particular column. You can either say this has to be one of these different values, either like this could be true or false, or this, like you could have a list of sites that are in your sites table, as we discussed earlier, and make sure that anytime you enter a value in there, it belongs to that predefined group. Or you can say it must be an integer and give it a range, or a decimal and give it a range. Or really with text, there's a way of programming almost any way of characterizing text. So you could almost say it must have this exact pattern. That's how websites validate if it's an email or a website or whatnot. So there's a lot of power in having a spreadsheet that has value constraints as far as making sure that the data that you enter is valid. Now the key is that it's a lot of hard work. So not only is it hard work to set up, but it's also it's quite a pain when you're trying to enter data and all of a sudden it won't let you, enter the data. Like maybe because the range that you gave is really, it was too narrow or something, and so you have to go back and change it. But in the end, it's worth it. So one of the databases I use quite a bit is very picky. It makes sure that every time you enter something, it's got, the minimum information that's required, and then there's all these relationships among different tables. And it makes life difficult a lot of times. However, it also prevents entering data that's not useful. So adding this tool called constraints, which is relatively straightforward to implement in spreadsheets, is very powerful. You can also, if you're using form-based data collection, you can also, like surveys and such, you can also validate data at the time of data entry. Google Forms, for example, provides a lot of options for validating the data that's entered. Exploratory data analysis, which is a whole other workshop that I look forward to giving someday, is, gets into that fun part of dealing with data, which is to, you finally collected, you got in this boring table, let's start looking at it. And that's one place to, you can find outliers and et cetera. It's such an, inherent part of science that I'm sure that y'all all are familiar with it. The real question is, when to exclude, data, and sometimes it's not always clear, but it is important. There are two things I'd like to convey. One is that there should be a reason why, like, if somebody measured a tree and it was, like 5 kilometers tall, then you say, well, this, is outside this range of plausible values, something must be wrong. The first thing you might say is, well, maybe it's not 5 kilometers, maybe it's 5 meters. But you would want to know that there's a reason why you either change the value or you exclude the data, or because an instrument has gone bad is another very common way, reason to exclude the data. But it shouldn't be because it's an outlier. That's how, like, that's how reality gets washed over, and is not scientifically valid. The other important thing, so even if you're not sure if it should be excluded, but you exclude it, it's not uncommon to read in a paper where they said, here's the analysis. I didn't see anything, but there's this one outlier. I don't understand why it's there. If we reanalyze it without that outlier, then these are the patterns that I see. So this is all about, you state your assumptions. You can describe these things in your Readme or in your metadata, why the data is gone. Yeah, so I guess that's what I'll say about the data validation. Okay, so describing the data. So this is probably, thank you all for being here. And we're about to get into a part of the presentation that some people may find incredibly boring. This is, if you remember back at the beginning, I was like, well, there's a fun part over on the left. And this is it's like, it's just so much work. And it really is a lot of work to have to, describe your data. I mean, all steps are really a lot of work, but this is sometimes, often the sticking point where it's, it's like, well, I just want to get my paper out. Why do I have to write up my readmes and all that? And really, it's the difference between the ability to use your data for a particular analysis and then publish the results, and the ability for people to actually make use of your data in the future. And so this is a nice figure that kind of shows, that the timeline of information content of the data. And so at the time you're collecting the data, you know everything. But if you don't write it down, you start to lose, specific details, maybe general details later. Finally, you just have this big table of numbers and a few names, and you're not really sure what happens. And so this is kind of a problem in science, in that the information, that's collected with a lot of effort becomes less and less useful with time if it's not adequately described. And it's not just for the purposes of other people who may reuse your data, but also for your own, for yourself to be able to, understand, interpret, and reuse the data. So I imagine people here have gotten back to a spreadsheet and not really been able to remember what a particular column meant or why they did something. So yes, I do want to emphasize that this, essentially good data hygiene benefits you first, and your supervisor and collaborators, and finally something that as a user of other people's data, I appreciate, well, not just for myself, but because I see that there's a lot of power in synthetic research, and it's becoming more and more evident. So making data available for reuse in larger scale syntheses will make science, enable science that would otherwise not be possible. So what is metadata? So there's all this information that you might want to know about metadata. You can think about it as almost everything except for that particular data point, except for like the height is 5 meters. Other than that, once you ask the question of like, well, the height of what? Well, this species, this oak tree over here was 5 meters tall, and where was it, and when was it? Okay, how did you measure it? Usually height it almost doesn't matter. You may think it doesn't matter. In some cases it does, but you might think, okay, height, it's easy to tell. There's no questions about it. But there's a lot of things, a lot of values that it really does matter how the data was measured. I'll give one example that I imagine Kamel is familiar with, is the leaf area index, or the number of leaves, the number of layers of leaves above the ground. Well, if you go out and you measure that by chopping down a forest and taking the area of all the leaves, then you've got a pretty direct measurement. But if you measure it by looking at the reflectance of the surface of the earth and using an equation to estimate the leaf area index, then you will, then those are very different. Those have very different meanings, even though they might be the same. Other very important information is, how is it structured? What, when you look at this file that I was looking at, that I was showing earlier, how is it structured? What are the variable names? Who collected it? Who gets credit? And also, how can the data be reused? If you don't provide people information about whether they can reuse it or not, even if you wanted to get reused, giving them the permission is important. So the Readme, if you see the Readme, you should read it. And if you have data, you should write it. It's a very simple in concept text file. It's got a number of consistent components that answer those questions that we just went through. So the bibliographic details, the information about what was being measured, all of the interpretation details should be available in a Readme file. And you may have one Readme for overall for the project, and then a different Readme for each data set. And another thing that people may not think about is that you can actually have a separate worksheet in your spreadsheet that's your Readme, that has your variable definitions that describes all of this. And later you can copy and paste that into a text file. But often it's useful to have it, a text file that can be available, easy for people to read, in addition to having it where you're developing your data in the spreadsheet. So let's see. So the University of Arizona Library has, and it's easy to Google for examples of Readme, but they've got some definitions of what should be in your Readme, but also sample Readmes. So things that you can download as a template and describe your data with sufficient detail. Yeah, so that's a good place to start. And then I already went through and showed this example of the neon data sets that we're covering. as an example of a README. This README actually has some images of where things came in, where things are available, some basic exploratory data analysis and summaries of the data, and time series. So this is to make it available, make it accessible to our collaborators. Okay, so you should, when you see something that says README, you should read it. And when you're collecting your data, you should write your README, not when you're getting to the point of archiving your data, but as you're collecting the data. It's the same, or at least write this information down in a lab notebook if that's where you prefer. So there's another question that comes up of standards and conventions, vocabularies. So we talked, using the example of spreadsheets, we talked a lot about having column names and making them and describing what's in them. So when you get to more complicated data, so for example, an image, or a satellite image, or a point cloud that is a three-dimensional representation of a of the land surface, for example. Well, those won't fit effectively into, that information doesn't fit effectively into a table. You could coerce it that way, but then it's much more difficult. So fortunately, so for those examples, the OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium, has come up with a very long list of standard file formats, not just for those data sets, but for other ones. And so what it allows is for different software programs to be able to read the same data. And so it already knows what to expect. I was mentioning earlier, like having, if you limit it to 3 columns rather than adding a new column for each species, your script will be able to pull in that data even as you extend it and make use of that data. This is at a whole different scale where, it's not just saying these columns must be named the same, but it's saying, this is the structure of the data, and people can, build up very elaborate software projects like, ArcGIS or MATLAB or command line tools for processing these data that can always understand what's happening inside of there. There's some other things that are useful about these file formats related to the efficiency with which the data can be accessed, as well as the ability to store information about the data inside the file itself to make it useful. And I'll show an example of that in a second. There's a few other things here which are conventions that are coming up about defining, in order to make your data useful for this community. So in the case of ICASA LD, that it's an agronomic, it's like a way of consistently storing agronomic information. It makes it so that the people who are collecting the data can put it in a format that's readily accessible for crop models. And also it kind of defines the scope of the data that's required to make use of these data sets, which can be different for different applications. But if we look at the context, for example, with crop models, it says this is the minimum information I need to run or calibrate or validate a crop model. So that's why that was built. I won't go a lot through many more of these, but I wanted to give a list of some that I think might be folks in this, in cows generally might be familiar with. So next is protocol. So we talked earlier a little bit about having data sets, having a README that's, that describes the methods, but then I don't know how many people here have ever been able to read a scientific publication and reproduce the methods that were in that scientific publication without referring to some other textbook or figuring, doing a lot of hard work on their own. So that's a common way of saying, well, we use their method, modified it a little bit with whatever own equipment we had, but it's not that useful. So then usually labs will have documents, the step-by-step procedures that lab uses, but commonly, or at least a decade ago, when I was working in labs, these things would be within the lab and maybe available on the lab website, but it would be difficult for somebody to point to that protocol and say, well, we use that, but we adopted it like this, and here's kind of, again, the provenance of how we've adapted that for our own studies. So there's some new approaches, there's some new tools that you can use. So I talked a little bit about version control, GitHub, and OSF, and the wiki there. But next I wanted to talk more in detail about this tool called protocols.io, which, for laboratory protocols, it does a lot of what GitHub does for software, but for lab protocols, as far as allowing you to, publish a protocol, get a unique identifier, essentially a citation to it, and somebody else can look at that, try and reproduce it, modify it, and as they modify it, they trace the provenance traces back to the original protocol. So I'm going to I'll give a little quick view of that. But the key content, similar to the Readme, is the bibliographic information and what was actually done, as well as, very importantly, like what could go wrong, and any references that this was developed out of. So to talk about protocols.io, well, here's one example of a protocol that I put on protocols.io, so that mainly because I was looking at it and trying to figure out how it could be useful for a project that I was involved in. And it is very useful. It's a little bit more overhead than just writing out a document, but I think that it's got a lot of potential, especially for protocols that will be reused. And down here is the copy and fork, like thing, so that you can take your own version and modify it. And if we look in here, you can see it's got kind of the instructions, some of the equations that were used. These are very specific for this project, explaining what we were doing with this protocol. And then it's also got the materials that were used. It links directly to this specific piece of equipment. And then the metadata includes a way in which this can be cited, as well as the original reference that the method was developed from. So that's another tool. So I pointed out Dmp Tool earlier. Protocols.io is very, very promising way of making your protocols more broadly available and reusable. And it's free for anybody to use if you keep your protocols public. To keep them private, it requires I think private and share it requires you to buy a subscription. Okay, so the last part of this is the preservation step. And this is also where, at all of these steps, I'd say the campus experts are at the library. I and my group can help provide a lot of the domain-specific kind of, I guess, applied interpretation of the big picture best practices that and guidance that you might have get from the library. But I can't say enough about how great the folks that I've met at the library here are, and also at other institutions I've been, since I realized what a great resource they are. So they're really they're experts, and they've got a lot of tools and information about how to make your data reusable. So finally, and this is really, one of the places that they can really help, which is when you want to store your data. I've talked a lot about file types earlier. The key thing is that you want formats that are open and documented and can be read by any software program. There's a lot of there are a lot of file types that are more efficient to use, easier. Like essentially, if you're using R, you might end up with an R data file. MATLAB has something analogous, and Python has its I forget the name of these pickles. Python has its pickles. Those are all very software specific, and they're very efficient, but R can't read a pickle. They can both read a text file, and they can both read all of these other formats, including CSVs. So, in 30 years, so Excel can be a text file. So not unlike 10 years ago when it was truly proprietary. Now you can dump all the information out from Excel, except that it won't come in. You won't get a table. You'll get like this crazy thing that looks like, that's XML. It's very hard to reconstruct, and so that's why CSV is preferred over Excel. Is that there's no reason to think in 30 years that some software will be able to read Excel, whereas you should be able to expect it can read. It will be able to read CSV. And it's really only recently that even R has been able to read directly from Excel without a lot of headaches. I think that's been in the past 5 years or so. Okay, so, and then the next question is, so which repositories? There's a lot of options out there. And again, this is a place where the librarian can help. Journal or funding agency may have some requirements or suggestions. Here's one example from Nature Scientific Data. They go through and they say, for this type of data, put it here or here or here. They give you options for each domain and each type of data. And then there's also, there's more generalist repositories. So Figshare is one, and the University of Arizona Library, their new repository is built on Figshare. And by generalist, I mean, you can put anything there. You can put any files, and it's pretty easy, and it's a relatively, it's a low bar. They don't require a lot of domain-specific information. Earlier, I was talking about minimum required metadata for a particular application. So this would, we'll say kind of the core metadata, but it may not have all of the information required, for example, for a particular scientific use case. So that's where a generic repository won't have as much constraint over the type of information that must be provided, or the types of files that must be provided as a domain-specific one. So I'd say usually if your data will fit into a domain-specific repository, that's where it should go. Also wanted to have a few minutes to talk about licensing and copyright. So as I mentioned earlier, having a license or terms of reuse or copyright, having it in your README is important, because if you don't have it, then people won't assume that they can reuse it. So there's a very common, it's very common for people to allow reuse with attribution. So for most materials other than software, that would be the Creative Commons CC BY 4.0 is essentially saying anybody can reuse it as long as they say where it came from. In software, the equivalent is the MIT, BSD, and Apache licenses. These are, there's a whole family of these licenses that are called permissive licenses. It allows people to reuse it. You have to keep the license available, but you don't. It's not like GPL 3, which I don't recommend, and it makes barriers to the reuse of the information. I don't recommend unless there's a reason to use it, and there's plenty of people who have reasons to use it, including wanting to make it free for use by for non-commercial use, essentially dual licensing, or just restricting its reuse. And that's there's definitely reasons to do it, but I wouldn't say that shouldn't be the first choice unless there is a compelling reason to do it. And then the next step is putting your information into the public domain. So there is I'll start with the software. I said NA. So there is a way of putting you can put the software into the public domain, but when I started researching that, there's some caveats about where the legalities of software licensing public domain is kind of, it makes it so it's not really easily reusable. But with data, you can put it under CC0, and some repositories require CC0. And the reason is that we're at a point where we can't track the provenance of data easily enough so at some point, I mean, there's all sorts of problems when you think about, the third derivation of data, who gets cited for that, and it's a complex problem that people smarter than I are trying to figure out. But the easiest way to make your data, most widely reused is to make it CC0, so that doesn't have this legal requirement that people acknowledge the source of the data. However, that the argument for using CC0 and Dryad has a great explanation on this, is that CC's, like, you shouldn't rely on the legal system to enforce scientific best practices or scientific conventions of saying where you got your data from referencing or citing the source of the data. So something that's CC0 doesn't mean that you don't need to cite it. It's but at the same time, people may feel less comfortable with the CC0, and that's why a lot of things are released CC BY, especially things like teaching materials or writings, etc. People don't want to just put it into the public domain, but for data, that's the way to make it the most free. And so that was a lot, and now I am at my relatively brief conclusion, which is that data management is hard, but it's rewarding. So with that, as promised, here's some resources that I have described in this talk, and some of the references that I provided. Somehow I feel I missed a couple. I just realized I missed a few slides. And now, if you want to follow up with me or my group, this is my email. And we've started having open office hours on Tuesday mornings from 8 to 10, where people can just drop in and chat. I didn't put the information up here, but I can provide that. So I can open up to questions.
Thank you so very much, David.